set the session recording. So the session is being recorded. So for those of you who would like to look at it again after the session, I'll refresh your memories on some of the stuff that Barry covers off. It will be available online within a few days of this session. Barry, over to you.
Thanks very much, David, and welcome everybody on this hopefully fine where you are Friday morning. Must admit I do like this online CPD lark. I think it's quite good being able to do it. You could be sitting anywhere, wearing whatever you like, doing whatever you like. So hopefully you're in a comfortable spot, not too comfortable that you'll fall asleep. You have your coffee, tea, or whatever beverage you prefer. And we're going to get into, I guess, part two of advice deconstruction. And deconstructing, I guess, more the advice documentation and process for a more consultative process with clients. So over about the next, 73 minutes now, we're going to have a look, because just recently there has been a new code of conduct for AFAs and the AFA monitoring report released by the FMA, on top of some other documents around the Financial Markets Conduct Bill and obviously the what seems controversial DIMS rules. I know David and the association are going to be doing some work around the update on the code, but I just thought I'd mention some of the changes that are relevant to what we're talking about today around advice process and documentation. Also, some of the feedback from the AFA monitoring, which was from the recent visits they have done in, I think it was Dunedin and Hamilton, which throw up some interesting reminders from their point of view, from the horse's mouth, as we like to say. Once we've done that, we're going to recap step one. Based on some of the feedback we got from the end of the last session, we're also going to delve a little bit deeper into how then you go from step one and look at how the written communication or the written advice can start from the end of that step. And then step two really is the advice bit. And so how does that look in a deconstructed process, and what options do you have around presenting your advice and therefore also documenting your advice? And I guess that's the key part we want to get out of today is, if you were to grab your current advice documentation or example, grab the scissors and start chopping it up, which bits can you put where? We've gone through this exercise recently with a group, and I'll be able to talk about some of the experience we've had. And also, we're starting to get some feedback on what's happening with people who are changing their process. Our normal disclaimer, this is class advice. If you want personalised advice, seek out a subject matter expert. But if you do use this advice and it works well, we'd be happy to hear about it. So, regulatory updates. The final version, I think, has been signed off of the new AFA Code of Conduct, signed off by the Minister, which is the last part before it goes into force. One of the first changes they have made is to Code Standard 1. And I guess what they've tried to do here is clarify that as an authorised financial advisor, you must place the interests of the client first when providing a financial advisor service. They've added that you must act with integrity and that these obligations are paramount. In feedback we have seen from the FMA, and even in investigations that we've been involved in where the FMA have been looking to investigate either complaints or issues with financial advisors, whenever they talk about how they apply the code, they try to discuss it in the fact that Code Standard 1 is paramount. So they've clarified that in the latest code standard, and that all the code standards work together. You can't just read one code standard on its own or rely on that just on its own. So, and this is one of the issues with principles-based regulation, is that you then have to figure out how that applies. Code Standard 5 is a tidy up, and also around, they've removed conflicts of interest as a discussion point and lifted it up into a fact that disclosing conflicts of interest is not enough. You actually need, advisors must effectively manage any conflicts of interest that may arise when providing a financial advisor service. So there's a bit more clarity around that point, but that's one of the changes. Still the same, so code standards that haven't changed but are applicable to the subject matter today, advice process, is that an AFA must behave professionally in all dealings with a client, communicate clearly, concisely and effectively. And that's really part of what we've been talking about with deconstructing the written documentation. We've looked at statements of advice and reports that have gone to clients that are not concise, are not clear, and that's really where they're trying to say, how as advisors can we communicate effectively? Also, overriding this, RFAs are probably sitting there and going, well, what does this mean for me? There are still requirements under the Financial Advisors Act around diligence, knowledge and care and skill, which if you wanted to figure out how they would be applied to your financial advisor services, the best way to do that is to obviously look at the code, because that's giving an indication or a better indication or clearer indication of what they're actually looking for. Code Standard 7, the advisor has to ensure that a retail client is able to make an informed decision about whether to use an authorised financial advisor's financial advice services. So this is a good bit, and I know I've seen some work on this whereby you're trying to say, I can give advice on, and we'll use insurance for example, but the types of advice around insurance can differ from, I can sell you some life insurance, to I can do a risk management plan to manage all the human capital risks in your business. And that's quite a big continuum. So what the regulator is saying here, or the co-committee, is that actually you need to make sure the services you provide are actually suitable for the client. And then Code Standard 8, obviously the services that we need to ensure that it's personalised services suitable for the client as well, which differs from just saying, so for example, you can't just say all clients should have $500,000 of trauma insurance, being class type advice. So we can't do that as part of that. They get very specific, obviously, about the investment planning service and Category 1 products under Code Standard 9, and ensure that the client has sufficient information, I guess, or explanation of the service to make, once again, that informed decision. I'm really glad to see they have tidied up one of the subheadings under this, which was around the use of research and being able to rely on third-party research, whereas previously, and I think it was under Code Standard 6 as well, it sort of said that you needed to make sure that the research was okay. Well, that's a little bit beyond, I think, what we would expect from a financial advisor, or reasonably expect. So, for example, if you are using Risk Researcher on profile, you should be able to rely on that research without having to check it out individually. That can be very helpful in the space for insurance advice, where it is a product or product provider that you don't deal with or don't have competence in their product range. You should be able to rely on a third-party research of that product to make your assessment or recommendation if you're going to make one.
Just a question.
Just
a question on that one, Barry. Do you think that there will still be an expectation to, at least at the outset, do some due diligence work around the research providers you're using?
Yeah, you would want to have probably a comment even in your ABS as to why you use that particular service. So yeah, it's a bit like, why do you deal with a product provider? You'd want to have an answer for that question if they did question you about it. Because if you said, I subscribe to Bob's research and Bob's my mate who sends me an information sheet on all the products, well, what authority or what competence does Bob have to do that? So that would be a question that could be asked.
Yeah. So really get some degree of comfort that the research you are using has some credence in the market.
Yeah, you would want to do some, or at least be able to demonstrate that there was some form of due diligence done, either by you or if you were part of an organisation. And TMP is a good example. We'll use that. They've done the research or recommend it, so you should theoretically be able to rely on them doing it as well. But you'd want to know that you've at least considered whether or not it's relevant or an acceptable level of research to be relied upon.
Yeah.
Reputable, I guess, is probably a better word, actually.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah. But yeah, don't, the key thing there would be, I mean, luckily we don't have a dearth of researchers in New Zealand in the different spaces. But the main ones, so for example, risk, you've got strategy, which is mainly information based. There's a bit of I'll give you a good example. Strategy is a good one. They rank products and they give them scores. In my personal opinion, it wouldn't be that you just know that, this is a 5-star versus a 3-star product. To me, that's not enough depth. You have to understand the scoring system that they utilize, or the methodology that they utilize to get to that ranking, so well, I recommend this one because it's 5-star, and I go, why is that? Because it scores well in these particular things, which, so you'd want a bit of depth in that. You can't just, so for KiwiSaver, you couldn't just use the Morningstar rating straight out of the newspaper and go, it had 5 stars in the newspaper, that should be good enough, because Morningstar's a reputable thing. Well, no, do you understand what the 5 stars mean? It must be good, it's 5 stars. That's not good enough.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah. So you need to understand the limitations of the research you're using, as well as the basis on which.
And I think QPR have thrown I think a good spin on this, in the fact that some of their research doesn't pop out until you give them enough detail about gender and age and occupation, because different products, while might be rated, say, an A because they rank well in definition, might only rank a B when it's for a female versus a male, or a B for one occupation and an A for another occupation. So, you're starting to see personalisation of research as well.
That's
which is a new spin on it.
Yeah. I think that answers Mike King's question too. He said, if you understand Strategy's system and have been a subscriber for 20 years, is that enough?
Yeah, I don't know, Mike. I'm not sure about that. Yes, would be the short answer. Yeah. And once again, if you can demonstrate knowledge, it's being able to demonstrate the knowledge of it. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool.
Because the thing is, over the years, you will have noticed as new products come on board, you'd see the ranking, and there must be times where advisors look at it and go, why has that got a ranking of this? I don't. And hey, I've gone and checked it out, and I understand it.
Yeah. Cool.
And then, of course, Code Standard 12, and this is, I guess, the bit that everyone says I must record in writing adequate information about any personalised services provided to retail client. I've come across recently, and I don't know what it is, whether I've just noticed it or whether it's just been the clients we've been working with recently, where advice is given and a product is neither, I guess, bought or implemented, and the advisor then decides, well, because there isn't a sale of a product or an implementation of a product, the advice is, they don't put the advice in writing because they consider that because the client didn't take their advice, they haven't given any advice almost. So just I guess a Baz's handy tip. Even if you give an opinion or recommendation that the client doesn't take, it's still advice, and we would suggest that goes in writing. Now, what I'm not saying is that you need to prepare a full record of advice the same as you would for a full plan, but at least an email saying, we did have a discussion about you were interested in buying, Genesis shares or whatever the thing it was, or you were interested in adding this. I recommended you do this. At the end of the discussion, you decided not to, for whatever reason. Then, at least an email confirming that conversation in a similar file note would be advisable. And also to show that any engagement, while might be, what were the limitations of that particular engagement. So yeah, something to watch. So I guess our one of the main reasons I just wanted to flick through those code standards again is because, ironically, while we're trying to help the advisor business become efficient in the way they document advice, and we're trying to help the client make informed decisions by breaking down the advice process or deconstructing it, ironically, and it was something we hadn't considered when we did it, was that it actually helps demonstrate more, almost individually, the different code standards. So it's a beneficial side effect of this process. Now, we're obviously in a principles-based regulation, which means the words all sound good and look good, but what does that mean for me in actual reality as an advisor? We like seeing AFA monitoring feedback, because this is where the regulator has gone out and engaged specifically, and the particular feedback we're quoting recently is from the Hamilton. And in fact, it was Jeff, wasn't it? We spoke to Mr. Jeff Goldsworthy.
Yes,
was it January, February?
It was actually December, I think.
Was it December? And he mentioned, obviously, he'd been part of that process. So we heard what he had to say. And luckily, the FMA have used him as an example of not what to do. So let's have a look at what Jeff did. No, I'm only joking. Is Jeff on the line? I don't even know if he's here.
No, I don't think he is, no.
All right. We can send in the recording afterwards. The first thing the AFA said about when they've gone in and reviewed, and generally, as I said, they review up to 10 files when they do a full monitoring visit. Not all advisors' disclosure documents follow the format prescribed by the regulations. Now, for some of you know that we do the TMP Verify service. We also do checking for certifying basic compliance for other companies, and I can tell you that 25% of disclosure statements, when first checked for both RFAs and AFAs, don't meet that prescribed format. So it's a pretty strict regulation, and the FMA have, over the last 2 years, got stricter on it. So when the far past they've let some stuff go, they're not letting it go anymore. The key finding they found, and I think Jeff mentioned this specifically, was the handling of the secondary disclosure documents. What they see is a lot of people giving out a generic secondary disclosure document which says, hi, here's how I work and how I operate, and here's all the companies, and here's the services, and here's how I get paid if I charge a fee and I don't charge a fee, and a commission and I charge a commission, and here's all the companies' rates and all the fees, and Ironically, not ironically, then what happens is, if you've done that, you are supposed to provide then a supplementary secondary disclosure specific to the advice you're giving the actual client. And they're finding, and we find the same thing, is that there may be a statement about how you get paid in a statement or a record of advice, but it doesn't meet the obligations. What we are suggesting as part of the deconstructed advice process is don't provide a generic secondary disclosure document up front. It's a regulated format, it's a regulated form, and so it has to be correct. And ironically, things like how I operate and my education and qualifications and things isn't actually required as part of the regulation. Yet because it was put into all the templates originally, people put it in there. So we're actually saying, shorten your disclosure document to the regulatory requirements and provide it with your written advice in the process, which is, and make it personalised only. So that's a bit of a change. And the reason we do that is, and we'll discuss that, is because we think you should use different engagement documentation. Code Standard 8, where this one comes in is I guess really is around why and how advisors clarify a risk profile and therefore the investment portfolio that matches. In fact, in the last week, I have seen three times in a row, different advisors have completed a risk questionnaire for a particular product or type of investment with a client, and then they've recommended a different portfolio at the end of it, and there's no evidence of why that decision was made. And sometimes when they explain it to me, it makes sense. Other times it doesn't. But there's very little taken into account or documented about this. So once again, the rationale of the advice might be right, but the evidence of how that actually happened, it doesn't actually fit. So documenting that is really important. For mortgage and risk advice, risk tolerance is something that's very, very rarely evidenced. People assume when they're talking about insurance products that they are actually discussing risk tolerance as part of it, but it's not always evidenced as a discussion around how could a client cope if their income stopped, long-term, medium-term, short-term. How could they, if the person was taken out altogether from the business or the family, what would be the effects? What else could they do other than insurance? Those things aren't evidenced, even though they might be discussed or understood by an advisor. With mortgages, how would a client cope with changes in mortgage rates? Just that discussion around structuring their mortgages and their loans and their debts, and thinking about, well, if it does move from 6 to 8, can they still afford it? So those are the things that the FMA are not seeing, or we're not seeing as well. The other one was around keeping up to date with a client's financial situation. This goes to the type of service and the type of agreement you have with a client. As you know, our golden rule is do what you say you do. If you say we're going to have an ongoing relationship as your financial advisors, then one of the requirements would be you need to keep up to date with your clients to make sure you're saying, hey, has anything changed in your world that would change the advice for the products that we are monitoring for you or using with you. The other way we see this handled, probably more in the insurance and mortgage space, is that we implement with you and then we're here later if you need us, but we're not monitoring what goes on or we're not providing an ongoing service, which you can do. You can say you don't do that. There's nothing that says because you sell someone insurance you have to be there on an ongoing basis, unless it's part of a distributor agreement you have with a product provider. So, yeah. But if you do say, I'm your advisor on an ongoing basis, then you do have an obligation to make sure the advice keeps up to date. And I'm not saying that means you have to sit with the client every year, but you at least have to communicate with them about that. Code Standard 9. This pops up not only for AFAs but also for RFAs, and in the complaints generally around replacement business or saying, hey, we want to move you over to here. Here's the benefits of the new place I'm going to put you, but it doesn't discuss the risks of moving and potentially the loss of benefits on the other side of it. An example I had recently where a client had said we only provide advice on one KiwiSaver provider. The client said, well, I'm with the Blue Bank. The advisor said, well, if you want me to be your advisor, you need to move over to my KiwiSaver provider instead of the one you're in. So the client said, we'll move. But there was no evidence of any comparison to allow them to make an informed decision about that move. It might have been the right answer, but there was no evidence that it was the right answer or any evidence of any analysis. And the advisor's argument with me was that they said, well, I can't advise on the ANZ product. And I said, well, that's true. You can't advise to sell or implement it, but you can do a side-by-side comparison. And there is generic information on all KiwiSaver providers available. So, yeah, risks and benefits of moving, or risks and benefits of your advice overall, rather than just the generic ones, should be outlined. And Code Standard 8, which is obviously providing written evidence of what happens, that's what a lot of the time we're seeing good advice not evidenced, and that's more the issue. So, just to make sure that you're awake after all that compliance talk, can you please tell us, when does the new AFA Code of Conduct come into effect?
This isn't a test of your general knowledge. It's just really whether you're aware of its existence and when it may come into effect. It's just been announced actually in the last week, Barry. It was last week, wasn't it? I think. Yeah.
It came out last week. The date. Yeah.
So I give you. On your screen,
you could hear. You could. Sorry.
So you should, on your screen, you should have a little poll. If you think you know what it is, or even if you don't, just have a guess. We're not testing you. The results are not monitored, so it's just really
We won't send it to the FMA.
Exactly. So I give people, only half the people have voted. The rest of them must be half asleep. Okay, give it countdown to 10, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go. Okay, let's share the results. So half the people think it's the 1st of May 2014, half the people think it's the 1st of June 2014. Nobody thinks it's July.
There you go.
What
I thought it was the 1st of June too.
Yes.
But what is it? It's not. It's the 1st of May.
It's the 1st of May, yeah. It's 1st of May.
There you go. So all my clients would have been a month out.
So about 3 or 4 weeks' time.
Yeah. Now, David, I know that there's probably some of the key changes in there are around actually CPD and professional development.
Yes.
So obviously the work that the association does will sort of get that out to members as to how that will impact them.
Yes, and how it impacts on our program. Interestingly, a lot of the changes that are being announced in the code effectively just solidify the thinking around our structured CPD program. So,
yeah, look, I think it does provide a bit more clarity. And I guess one sort of handy tip would be obviously the professional development to get what we call, well, there's only structured training now. There's no unstructured or structured, which I think is a good thing. You're either doing professional development relevant to your advice services or you're not. So the days of being able to rock up to a presentation on high frequency trading when you're a risk advisor and go, well, that was structured and I did the 5-question test at the end of it, well, that doesn't make sense now. So yeah, we're recommending to people to look at the program ahead for the year that's available to them through NZFAA and their other product providers, for example, to then work backwards and go, well, if those are the things that are coming up that are relevant to what I give, then I'll put my PD plan together against that. So anyway.
Yeah, I mean, one of our guides is always that as part of your PD plan, there's a couple of things you probably want to have as on every plan. One is that keep up to date with changes in the products that you deal with, and the second one is to keep up to date with legislation and regulations affecting my practice. So there would be two key goals. Anyway,
there'd be two straight off the bat. Yeah. It was funny, I was reading one the other day, and the PD plan was, go to the association's conference and go to this conference and go, okay, that's probably not a development plan, but I know what you mean. Anyway,
yes.
Let's recap step 1 of the deconstructed advice process. Now remember, I decided that there are 4 types of advice situations we see financial advisors in. One is you're getting a new client where you're going to give financial advice, and that may or may not result in them implementing or cancelling a financial product. So that's financial advice in the bit that's regulated under the FAA. Obviously, there are times where clients go, no, I don't want you to give me advice about whether I need it or not. I want you to sell me a product. I want you to put me in KiwiSaver. I want you to get me a mortgage. So then we've got a new client where really it was product sale or product advice only. Then we've got existing clients who are under advice, who you would then review their changes in circumstance to then determine whether your advice is right and therefore look at whatever impacts that has on the different products. And you'd obviously have existing clients who are product only, who you'd be saying, is the rate still okay? Do you want to refix your mortgage? Is your insurance premium's gone up? Can I help you with that? Obviously, the idea would be that if you do have product-only clients, that one day they'll become advice clients where you get an advice about suitability and needs. And everyone then becomes your existing client under advice. So the process we're talking about today around the deconstructing is where you're giving financial advice to a client about their needs or suitability for your products. We went through last time the traditional 6-step process. And we talked about the different steps, and we tried to understand what does the client actually see or get in their hands or more importantly, what is it that the lawyer will have to beat you around the head with if something goes wrong? And we decided that obviously there's a lot of importance placed on the statements of advice or reports or rockers or fockers or whatever you guys call them that go to the clients. And a lot of that sits to the fact that the client gets one chance to go, well, here's the scope of the service, and is that what I wanted, and is it suitable, and did I agree to that? Have they described has the advisor understood my current circumstances, and yeah, that's roughly where I'm at. The needs and objectives, is that what I want, is that what I need, is that what they're saying I need? Options and strategies. They then, in a lot of the template ones, then have descriptions of the products and services that are available, the advisor's recommendations and how they meet their needs and circumstances, the assumptions and warnings, the costs, and the research and product information might be attached. It's appendices generally, or quotes. So that's a hell of a lot of information that they might be expected to digest in a single meeting and then make decisions or informed decisions on. We think that's quite a tough ask. So step one was engagement. We're suggesting that you have a scope of service or a terms of engagement that you agree with the client. You might do that at the end of the first or second meeting once you've agreed what you're going to go away and do. But we'd suggest actually giving them something to take away at that point. Also, we introduced the product and service guide that we suggest using with the client, which could include your terms of engagement as part of it as well. You're gathering their current circumstances and you're identifying the needs and objectives. As I said in the last week, it's either last month, sorry, might be one meeting, might be a couple of meetings. It doesn't really matter how or when that happens, but those would be the key parts of a deconstructed process. The point there is that we want to sort of stop and say, well, okay, before we do that, I've got another poll. The next poll is,
right, so
what do you currently cover off during the engagement process?
Now, there's two stages to this because there's quite a lot of items we want to check for. So there's part A and a part B. So I'll run them consecutively. We'll start with part A. So which of the following forms part of your current engagement process? So there's 4 items there, or none of the above, to get people to vote. You can tick more than one, so if you include all of those, tick all 4. Yeah. If you use none, then tick none. So give people another 15 seconds. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Only half the people are voting for some reason. Okay, let's close that one for us.
Have we got a few telephone people today?
Don't think so. I'll just do the second part of this. So the second one is same question, but some additional items. So preferences or limitations, privacy statement, obligations, and service offer. Do you include those as part of your current engagement process? So I'll get you to tick the ones which are relevant to you. Once again, this information gets captured at a generic level rather than individual level. So count down from 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Finish. Okay, close the poll. Let's share the results of the first one. So the first one, part A, so everybody who voted obviously includes their disclosure statement. 2/3 note remuneration, 40% note fees, product, platform, or cancellation fees. 47%, or approximately half of those that voted, include conflicts of interest. Let's go to the second one. Share results on the second one. In the second part, so preferences or limitations, about 1/3 of people, so 38 to 40% of those that voted would include that in their engagement process. Privacy statement, 81%. Obligations, 75%, so 3/4. Service offer, 69%, and 13% don't have any of those in their engagement process. So
Okay, cool.
I guess I'd be interested to know how consistent that is with your findings, Barry.
Yeah, look, we see I guess, a menagerie of different ways that advisors engage. And in fact, our advice has changed over the years. And the fact that we, for example, we had advisors who were using client booklets where the terms of engagement were described in the client booklet, which was used as a fact find, and the client was signing that, but then we realised, well, the advisor's taking that back to the office and filing it, or using it for their advice process. So the client actually doesn't end up with the privacy statement and the what we do and how we do. As I also said, a lot of the information is contained in a generic secondary statement, and 85% of advisors I talk to go, well, the client never reads the secondary, either of the disclosure statements. Some advisors obviously take the clients through those as a selling point. But once again, my personal opinion is that's quite clunky because it is a regulated form. What we are now starting to see is the development of forms from a business point of view, and those of you who were on the workshop, we had some examples of things like company profiles and brochures that explain what advisor businesses do and how they do them. So one of the things we're starting to see developed in lieu of a secondary disclosure statement, because RFAs, for example, don't have a secondary disclosure statement, is an about us or a product and services type guide. So who we are, what we do, how we do it, the products and services we offer, definitions. And interestingly enough, the products and services and the definitions that you can almost, if you took a statement of advice that you do, where you always have, this is what life insurance is, this is what YRT is versus level, this is what accelerated means. I don't know what I told you the other day. There was a client, an advisor, whose client said to him that she'd been reading about the different products and she quite liked the accelerated trauma than the standalone trauma because she assumed that it was accelerated that it would get paid faster. Thought that was quite funny. So definitions of jargon. So you can actually explain quite a bit about how you choose mortgages or you choose investments or the type of products or the product providers in a document up front. And that takes a whole lot of pressure of having to provide that information as part of your personalised written advice. Our mission, what we want to do for you. The other one could also be how your services work over time. So this is what we do for review, and this is what we do around claims management, and this is how we report investments to you, etc., etc. So that gives you a chance to talk to a document that's client-centric, specific to your business, and helps the client make an informed decision about whether they want to do a full plan or just buy a product off you. As part of the engagement piece, though, obviously disclosure statements. So we're suggesting you have to give your primary one, and for RFAs your lovely little here's 3 ways to complain about me disclosure statement. So we have to get that out of the way. We always suggest making sure that you agree the remuneration. So giving someone a secondary disclosure, in my opinion, doesn't work. And it doesn't, the fact that it doesn't evidence that the client's agreed to any fees, cancellation fees, or whatever it happens to be. All they've done is been informed that they're there. A lot of the time, we'll see planning fees described in a secondary disclosure, but the planning fees actually only apply to the investment part, not the risk part. But there's no way of the client telling. And then in the statement of advice, it says all our fees and remunerations are described in our secondary disclosure. Well, if it's a generic discretionary disclosure, then we think that's a fail from a regulatory point of view. We also don't think it's very transparent and clear for the client as well. So conflicts of interests, that could be part of that. Preferences or limitations around product providers and services. Your privacy statement obligation. That information, as I said, we see a lot of advisors getting that signed and then putting it back in their client file. We're suggesting have a document, could be terms of engagement, could be part of the About Us guide that you give to the client and go, there's the terms that we engage, and then you have a client acknowledgement where it's signed off saying, we agreed, we've received the disclosure statement, we've received the product and services guide, and we've received and understood the terms of this engagement. And if there are multiple ways that you get paid, agree which one it is that they're going to be paid. So basically at the end of step one, we have the client has been engaged. We can demonstrate that we've sorted out the suitability of our services, and hopefully one of the clients made an informed decision because of the information we've actually given them up front. You will have then gathered the facts that you need to know relevant to the scope of service, and the objectives have been gathered, agreed, communicated, whatever it happens to be. That was step one, which we discussed last month. Now for the advice bit. What happens next? I was on a course, a business insurance course, and this was going back a long time, nearly 18 years ago. Merv Chan was the chap who was running it. Some of you may know Merv. He's been around. He was with AdvisorLink for a number of years. And he said something on that course that really stuck with me because I thought it was really good. The ultimate form of service, a financial service a financial advisor can provide, is consultative, ethical selling. I think the traditional 6-step process isn't consultative, or it isn't naturally consultative in its way. It's an expert delivering advice and saying, here's what you should do. I think New Zealanders would respond better to a consultative process. There'll be times where they say, you tell me, because they trust you. Interestingly, in a recent FMA presentation, they've actually started to see that a lot of consumers are making their financial decisions not in an informed way, but in the fact that they like their financial advisor and they reckon they can trust him. So therefore, whatever he says, they'll do. They're saying that's not good enough. They're saying that financial advisors need to ensure that the client is making that informed decision. So going back to the KiwiSaver example I had previously, it's not just good enough for the advisor to go, well, if you want me to be your advisor, you have to be in this KiwiSaver instead of the one over here. The advisor still has to do the work to inform the client, well, if you're going to make that decision, here's the information you need to understand that the fees are higher in my one than they are in that one, for example, or there's a difference in the management structure or whatever it happens to be that's relevant to that service. So the deconstructed process is trying to demonstrate that it's been consultative throughout the steps. So after step one, what we're suggesting is instead of going away, doing all the quotes, putting all your analysis done together, is actually to communicate back to the client in writing, preferably, maybe with a follow-up meeting, though, or an email even, and we see this used quite a bit. And really what this is, if you were to take the first couple of sections off your current statement of advice and say, here's the scope of service, here's your current circumstances and the needs and objectives we agreed, and chopped it off there, it's basically that part of the document and sending that to the client and saying, here's my understanding of your situation. Let's dig a little bit deeper and see what that first written communication could look like. So for example, if you were to go back to them and go, and this is something that we don't always see evidenced in files, is why was an advisor or sitting with a client in the first place? That can go a long way to actually demonstrating whether or not we understand, or the client understands around suitability of advice services. So for example, as an insurance advisor, you may have had a client referred to you by a mortgage broker, for example, and said the client would like to look at some mortgage insurance or mortgage repayment insurance options. You then sit down with them. In the deconstructed advice process, then you'd say, so, what are you looking for? What is it? What's your situation? And then what we're suggesting is if you then went through your product and services guide and say, hey, look, we can put in place mortgage insurance options. That's really easy. We do that all the time. But let me explain what our personal protection plan, which we like to do for clients, and what that looks like. It's a 3-step process. It helps you make an informed decision about the insurance options you have across all the insurable events. And look, you may wish to take that up, and we'll fit that to your budget. So if you're communicating back to them that after that discussion in our meeting yesterday, you said you wanted me to prepare a plan and that you'll look at those options and then we'll make it fit within your budget, then we're really clear on what the scope of the service is. That's in comparison to what we normally see, which is just a tick next to life cover and a tick next to income protection, which doesn't tell us the story of how we got to whatever the scope of the service was. So when we're saying communicate back to, I guess, the basic client data, a lot of the time we see name, age, date of birth, smoker, non-smoker, married, employed, which is all very basic, and it's the basic information you need to do an insurance quote. What we don't always see is an understanding or I guess the qualitative bit about their circumstances. So what situation are they in? So, in this example, hey, you just bought a house, you'll be moving in 2 weeks. You both work and have some employee benefits available through your business. We look at those. Children go to school. You've got no other major financial objectives at this stage, but, your priority was obviously protecting the liability you've taken on with the mortgage. But, hey, that's how we understand your current situation. The next step is around, I guess, is what are their objectives for the insurance plan, and also demonstrating, I guess, your understanding of their risk tolerance. For insurance, one of the easiest ways to do that, we think, is just to say to them, if your income stopped tomorrow, what would happen? It would be really good to get an understanding of what the client thinks would happen in that circumstance, either short term, so immediately, and then, if that was to happen for, 6 months or longer, what would happen? That would give you some idea of their availability of financial resources that don't always show up on a client's balance sheet. Oh, that's another thing. Oh, I forgot. One of the things that we see working really well for financial advisors is actually presenting back to clients a basic financial position. A lot of the time we only see assets and liabilities recorded that are coming into play with the advice, though we are starting to see more and more, both with mortgage advisors and some investment insurance advisors, that if they help the client understand their financial position, i.e. assets and liabilities and the income expenditure, and I'm not saying do a budget for everybody, but at least understand, are they saving or not? Because if they're not, that means they're spending it. So what would happen if they didn't have it? Once clients actually see on a bit of paper what their financial position is, it actually helps to demonstrate, well, here would be your position tomorrow if your income stopped, which was one of the things Sue Lang talked about on the TMP seminar series recently. What is their position in an insurable event without your advice versus what's their financial position if they did have your advice? So yeah, we're seeing really good traction with people who help put together a basic financial position for clients as part of whatever advice services they're doing. And then for the objectives, we then discussed the specific insurable events and your objectives, and we agreed as follows. So you could then list, well, in the event Bob died, or in the event Sally died, or event you were unable to work, short term, this is what you'd need to do, long term, this is what you'd need to do. So to give you them saying, so what you want to do is you want to protect the house and you want to make sure the family is looked after for at least 5 years if anything happens to either of you. That's your main objective, and I understand that. That's where the communication would basically stop. So as I said, it's sort of that first third of a normal statement of advice. You're then saying to them, well, that's our understanding, and we can prepare your insurance plan based on that information above, but hey, have we actually got that right? Is there anything we've missed? And if you've had a chance to go through our product and services guide, are there any other areas that you'd like to look at? So for example, the client may, through your discussion of the insurable events, have limited you back to just income protection and life insurance and isn't interested in health or other areas you give advice. For example, they may limit you to KiwiSaver but not want to do a retirement plan. Or for mortgage, they might limit you to mortgage but not want to do insurance. So this is your chance to go, hey, you just want me to put the mortgage together and we've done the application, we're about to go through and proceed with your approval. Did you have a chance to look at the insurance guide and do you want to put that in place? So I guess we discussed this a little bit last time, but I wanted to go through again. I mean, if we think about this from the client's point of view, what are their expectations? And I guess what would they think if they got that first communication? We're starting to see that clients, advisors who do this, the clients are responding really well to getting fed back their own situation. And I guess it's a bit like, some people like to talk about themselves. This is a situation where they get to a chance, potentially on paper, the first time, to see their situation. And as I said, their basic financial position could be very valuable information to them. It may identify risk. It may put them in quite a pleasing position in some cases if they can see, they've got good assets. So what we're trying to do there is to say, cool, as a client, have they understood what you do? Are you going to meet their expectations? We talked about the trust bit. There might be times where a client just goes, actually, I don't trust this guy. So had you gone to all the effort of putting all the work together, putting the plan together, they may still have said no, not for any logical or financial reason, just because they didn't feel it was right. You've also got a chance to confirm, that they'll know what it's cost. You can make sure that your plan's going to fit within their budget and reiterate that. And hopefully, if you meet those expectations, they'll say, yes, that's what we've got. You've summarised what we want. If you can deliver a plan to budget that achieves those objectives, we're in. I'll tell you what, you've pretty much sold them at that point there as far as proceeding to the next steps. So step 2 is really the advice documentation. So how do we then take our advice to the client, present our strategy or options or the recommendations we have? Product and service descriptions would need to be included where we start to get specific. Hey, we're recommending this particular product type and here's why it fits your circumstances or your needs. Here's why we're recommending these sums insured which will do this and this. We're not using TPD because we've got IP or vice versa, all those types of things. So that step 2 can be done 2 ways. One is you could potentially have a meeting or a Skype type meeting, or you can deliver and send them a report. As we've mentioned before, statement or record of advice. A statement of advice is where you deliver the advice in writing before the decision, and a record of advice is after the decision. But remember, don't call it that. Call it an insurance plan or protection plan. Call it whatever you like, but don't call it those, because we think it's jargon. Now, the 2 options for documenting that advice. The first one is the traditional statement of advice. Remembering we've already delivered in writing, either via email or via document, their current situation, the scope of service, their objectives, and their needs. So now what's going to be left to pop into your statement of advice really are, well, here were the needs and objectives we agreed in that document. Here's the analysis of your situation. So you'd mention that. You may include it in the statement of advice, or your analysis might be, well, based on that, here's what we're going to do around disability or around your income. You may or may not have a particular strategy that you've agreed on what you're recommending, but the key will be, here are your options and the recommendations. You need $1 million of life cover. You already have 500,000 of life cover. Here's what we could do. Your rationale for those recommendations, any warnings or assumptions, and you'd have an implementation schedule ready to sign off to say, cool, based on those recommendations, what are we going to implement? And let's agree any variations to that. The second option is instead of preparing the statement of advice, is actually not to put any advice in writing at the second meeting or third meeting, depending on your process, but to actually go to the client with your quotes, your analysis, the options, the products you're recommending, as I said, the analysis, and there's actually no sign-off at that point, but the client may agree, yes, that's what we want to do with this investment, this mortgage or whatever, and you might turn around and actually start to sign up the product implementation process. The reason there's no sign-off, because at this point you haven't presented any recommendations in writing, you're actually using a consultative process of building the insurance plan or the investment plan with the client. So they're sitting with you, putting it together, rather than you putting it together and presenting it as you would in a statement of advice. You would then prepare a record of advice, which covers off how the decisions were made and the rationale for those decisions, both yours and the client's. So I guess those are the 2 key ways we see advice being delivered as part of a deconstructed process. And both of them have the opportunity, because there is no generic information in them, to be more concise documents and potentially, we think, clearer communications than current templated type statements of advice that are going out.
Barry, just a quick question: are you seeing any evidence of increased use of voice recording technology to record advice and/or meetings?
Yeah, we're definitely seeing more evidence of advisors using voice recorders, or I guess dictaphones, for lack of a better term, old technology, post meetings, or even sometimes at the end of meetings, to summarise decisions and things as well. And that then is either being typed up or saved. So sometimes they use it as a file note for them for when they then put the written advice together, or they give it to somebody else to type up. And in fact, one of the guys down Wellington does exactly that for the step one. The end of the first meeting, where they've agreed all the objectives and what they're going to do, he sits back in the car and just talks through, here's my understanding of your circumstances, here's what we've agreed the scope of services, here are what I think your needs and objectives are. That gets sent away. I think it's to Transcribe Me is the name of the company. That then gets put into an email back to him in text. He can then put that back in an email to the client, but he also then tidies it up just to make sure it's all makes sense. Fires that back to them. It's usually back to with the client within 48 hours of that first meeting. And clients are like, my God, because he didn't sit there and write it all down with a pen, but they just go, yep, that's it. That's us. So.
Right. I think one of the areas that, particularly in the risk space, that can, and particularly in the mortgage space as well, is the he said, she said, or didn't say in the event of a complaint or an issue that occurs later on in the process.
Yeah.
If you've got a recorded, just take an example. You're preparing a prop with a client. Ask them questions about particular health issues. Then they vehemently state that they didn't say, or they did say something as part of that prop process, but wasn't recorded on the prop. Having a recorded evidence of what discussion did take place, presumably is helpful there. Could be helpful.
Oh, look, yeah. I mean, it's the ultimate form of evidence, I guess. So if a client has agreed to allow you to record a meeting, you could do that. That's not for everyone's cup of tea, and I don't know whether I'd recommend that, but if someone said to me, if I did that, would that be good from a risk point of view? Obviously it would be. Though there are other ways to mitigate that non-disclosure risk that we recommend around sending the client those statements after signing and saying, please make sure these are true and correct, reminding them of their duty of disclosure and the continuing duty of disclosure. And we have found in 3 instances this year that particular action has been enough to avoid an advisor being accused of telling a client not to disclose, I guess.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I guess it's horses for courses at the end of the day, isn't it?
Absolutely. So we're not saying don't do it, but you don't have to do it. You don't think that that's the only way you're going to get complete, risk mitigation. So that record of advice process that document could be quite short, because if you've got evidence of the quotes, the options, and the analysis that you took to the meeting, that just goes back in your file. It doesn't have to go into the record of advice necessarily, but that document can be quite small. So I guess the key differences from the traditional 6-step advice process is that the communications or I guess the advice in writing, is a lot more personalised, which is the key thing that keeps coming through. Templates are dangerous, and I'll give you an example of one I had this week, where an advisor's opening statement under their scope of service said, we agreed that, or you agreed that you wish to complete an insurance review, and that the objective of the review is to ensure that you will live comfortably in the event of death or serious illness. Just not sure that's really what they wanted, living comfortably in the event of death. So that was an example of a template whereby, because the person was single and didn't have a family, the family bit was removed, leaving a stupid statement, which would just go to show there's not a lot of diligence going on there as well, which is one of the key things in the end. The other thing too is you're only recommending to meet agreed needs, so you're not having to present necessarily a process that says you need $10 billion of insurance, but I know you're not going to take that, so now that I've done my work putting these $10 billion quotes together, let's now sit down and agree what you can actually afford, and that happens quite a bit. I know advisors get frustrated with that. The documentations are smaller, also there's potentially less work because all the generic stuff's up front in your product and services guide and terms of engagement, so you keep all that out of your advice documents. The way we get the client to demonstrate that they've got that product and services guide is obviously an acknowledgement along with the disclosure and the terms of engagement on your scope of service sign-off. And you only end up doing work that is agreed with the client. So if the client at the end of step one goes, nah, actually we went online and bought it with Life Direct, which they might have done anyway, even if you had put together a full report, you haven't had to go ahead and complete that work. We also recommend adding next steps and options, I guess, to that part. And it is a part they look for, so the client understands what's going to happen next. Also, the risks of not implementing. A lot of people will say, no, I don't want to do this or I don't want to do that. Well, you run the risk of losing your house in 6 months if your income stops. The other thing we don't see a lot of in that risk space is where someone says, no, I don't need this. It's just making them aware that could they live off a sickness benefit or off, do they understand exactly what ACC pays out? Ironically, we don't see that information put through to clients a lot of the time. I don't know whether we just assume everybody knows what that is. So our next poll, and one of our last polls, is does your current advice documentation include a next steps after a client agrees to implement, the options that they have around those next steps, and the risks of not implementing?
Right, I'm going to put a challenge to the floor to see if we can get 100% responses on this poll. The most we've managed so far is 64%, so let's give it a go. So it's launched, and we'll give you, say, 20 seconds to respond. So again, you can tick as many as you like. If you don't do any of them, then...
We need to get that poll music going, don't we?
We do, yeah.
Really bad poll music. Not that kind of poll music. Elevator music, maybe.
Exactly. I'll see if there is an option to do that. So we've got 64%. Oh, we get close to 70%. All right, 10 seconds. 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I'm going to close the poll. We didn't make it. That's 75%. Okay, let's share the results. A large proportion, 75%, would include next steps in their documentation. 84%, so this is of the respondents, so there's about 24 responses. 84% would include options. Only 21% would include risks of not implementing. And there's obviously a couple of people who wouldn't include any of those in their advice documentation.
So the bit about the risks of not implementing is sometimes it's just good to, once again, I think this goes back to what Sir Lang was talking about around your advised position versus your non-advised position. So it's just that bit at the end where you go, well, they've decided not to proceed, and they're just going to take the life cover to match the mortgage. If you've put the advice out there and they've decided not to do it, we can demonstrate that they've made an informed decision not to do that. But it could be good also just to clarify exactly what the engagement is now that they've only put that one product in place, because they haven't taken your advice. If they also take none of your advice, I suggest making sure you close that down, because if you've given advice and they haven't bought a product and they've signed a scope of engagement but they're not bought anything, some people go, well, they're not a client anymore because they haven't got a product with me. So you've got to be clear. Are they advice client who just hasn't bought a product, or are they a product-only client now? Make sure that's clear in your file and that they understand what the service levels are that would be provided in that circumstance. So closing engagements is just as good is just as important, I should say, as carrying them on. So if you're following this two-step or broken deconstructed process, what we're trying to do is give the client the opportunity to make an informed decision. They get to be engaged potentially deeper in the process as they go along. We don't want you to be able to spend time doing unnecessary documentation that doesn't get used. And those two key decisions, which relate to Code Standards 8 and 9 around the making an informed decision about your service and then understanding your advice services, we think are demonstrated very well. The business benefits of doing this, look, we reckon if a client understands, they will buy. And it reduces the risk to you guys of giving advice that isn't taken up. So those are the key business benefits. The action points out of here, and this will follow up obviously on your feedback, is, do you need to review your process? So one of the things to do would be to lay out on the table the documents you use and which ones the client gets. If you were then to look at the presentation, you can obviously have a look at this, start to cut out what are the generic stuff that we're saying to all clients that we could put in a guide to give them up front. Where in our statement of advice could we cut that in half to split the two deliveries or the two options? And once again, if you are putting the reports together, get your client someone else to read those reports to make sure they make sense. And, why not ask clients for feedback on the documentation as well to see whether or not they found it useful. What happens once you agree on implementation? And really that is obviously delivering that client experience. And we've talked a little bit about that. And that topic was covered off in one of the sessions we did last year around customer experience. So I'd suggest if you wanted to see more about the processes around once a client agrees to implement and what to do there, I can't remember the date of that one, maybe it's September's last year, Compliance Matters, but that covers that area off really well. Question time.
Okay. All right, there's a couple of questions that have gone on as we've been going through the session today. Okay, so I'll go from piece by piece. Jonathan Marshall wanted to know. We talked earlier about KiwiSaver, and do you have any guide on recommendations on where we would get tools to enable us to do a comparison of KiwiSaver information side by side, so that when
there's a couple of ways you can do it. There's the hard way, which is cheap, and then there's the easy way, which costs a bit of money. The first one is that each KiwiSaver provider now has to provide an information sheet on their KiwiSaver scheme, and some of that information is actually summarised on a website which has been put out by the Retirement Commission or the Financial Literacy Commission as well around each KiwiSaver. So you are able to access some of the, quantitative data around fees, funds under management, etc. So those information sheets. So you can go to, and they have to have those information sheets on their websites. It's a legal requirement now for KiwiSaver providers. The other option is that part of the work we've done. Was it last year or the year before?
It was I think it was the end of the year before. Yeah.
We do a KiwiSaver provider selection process at IDS. So we buy data each year of David Chaplin, which gives us the ability to populate a selection process that allows you then to customize it and put in your own qualitative data as well. And look for, NZFAA members. What would we charge NZFAA members, David? We can put a deal around that. So if you contact David, if you're interested in getting that data and also the 5-step process for putting together analysis of all the KiwiSaver schemes, have a chat to David and we'll put a deal together for NZFAA members.
That sounds cool. Yeah, that's really cool. Actually, that document that David put together is actually really quite useful.
Yeah, well, what we've done is we obviously take that and we've summarised it as we do for individual clients who do. So we've got about 6 to 7 clients around the country, organisations who we now repeat that for each year. So they redo it each year. And man, it changes. Gee, it changes.
Yes, yeah, I'm sure it does, yeah.
It's interesting.
Cool. All right, so hopefully that answers your question, Jonathan. I've had a couple of questions from people. How many people are responding to the polls, and what's the audience? Which is an interesting question, because if people aren't responding to the polls, it makes you wonder whether they should be none of the above in the category, or whether there are other reasons for not responding. So the total we've the total audience of 28. And the responses we've got between
24 on that last one.
56% was the first one, and then 75% was the last one. So, okay.
So we should start failing all the people who don't respond.
No. I'm not sure we can do that. So another question. From Linda says she's confused regarding disclosure. As an AFA, my understanding is that all disclosure must be given pre-giving advice. Yet your discussion suggests that the secondary disclosure in particular, the disclosure can be given at the same time the advice is given. Is that what you're suggesting?
It's exactly when it has to be given.
Because
you can't give it. No, you can't give a secondary pre-advice because it has to be personalised to the advice you're giving. So you can't give a secondary disclosure to someone before you know what you're going to recommend them. So what you should do with a secondary disclosure is go, right, I've put together this financial plan, and I'm recommending KiwiSaver and insurance implementation for these particular companies. And here's my secondary disclosure document. This now tells you the conflicts of interest, the remuneration I'm going to charge you for the financial plan, and if you do implement my advice, I will get this from the KiwiSaver provider and this from the insurance provider. So there's no way you can give a personalised secondary disclosure until you've done the advice.
Yeah, I understand. So that's predominantly around the remuneration.
It's all the secondary. The FMA stated that the secondary disclosure statement needs to be personalised to the advice you're giving. So they actually don't like people using it as a generic secondary statement up front. The problem the industry had with is that the primary disclosure statement for financial advisors basically says, I can give you advice on these, I'm authorised to do this. I've got between 1 and 5 or more companies, and I get paid by a variation of fees or no fees and commission only or extra benefits. It doesn't tell a client anything about your business. So what we did was, some of the professional associations threw in a whole lot of information that was in the old disclosure regime into the start of the secondary disclosure, even though the regulations don't require it. So our view is, don't do that. Leave the secondary disclosure as a regulated form to give when you give your advice, and use a product and service guide or a terms of engagement to describe what you do, how you do it, and how you get paid.
And that raises a question. And in terms of conflicts of interest at the engagement point, because as I understand it, conflicts are disclosed in the secondary disclosure.
They have to be disclosed in the secondary, but they can also be, obviously, if there are potential conflicts of interest as far as product provider relationship, which is the main ones they look for. What benefits will you get that are a conflict with the advice you could give? Mm-hmm. So other relationships you would have in either a terms of engagement or an About Us guide.
Okay, so not necessarily the disclosure. Okay. So and again, Linda makes the point, secondary disclosure still needs to be a separate document to the statement of advice. It needs to be Definitely. Specifically held out from the statement of advice. Okay.
So people at the moment who are using a generic secondary, what they tend to do is wrap the supplementary disclosure around remuneration and conflicts of interest into the advice documentation. So what we said, and this is one of the things we covered off with Jeff, was pull that out. You can use a supplementary secondary disclosure. And if you are using a generic, you must use it. And it must be, as Linda states, a separate document or a separate page to the advice documentation you're using.
Yeah, and she also makes a point, which I think is right. Most advisors, most AFAs at the moment, they have a generic secondary disclosure, which they're giving at the same time as their primary.
I know, and I want to change that. That's my mission for 2014.
Okay. Two other questions, because I'm conscious of time. We need to about 8 minutes before we need to finish up. Carol says, I'm vague about what exactly is a conflict of interest, and she makes a point that this is a whole area of that could be a whole area of discussion. Just quickly, in sort of relatively succinct terms, what would you describe as a conflict of interest that would need to be disclosed in the secondary disclosure?
Preferential terms. So if you're a member of and I'll use an example, Sovnet, where you get an extra 10% because you've signed a form that says you'll give the majority or a percentage of your business to that company, that's a conflict of interest. If you have shares in a product provider that you recommend, that's a conflict of interest. What else? If you are a member of a platform or a shareholder in the platform provider that you use or the service provider you use, that could be seen as a conflict of interest, because you're more likely to recommend that a client uses a product or a service that you're part owner of because you believe in it. Well, rather than stay where they are, you might lean your advice towards, well, you can't stay with ANZ, you need to come with me because it's a better system for you. So, but if you own part of it, then yeah, that's a conflict of interest.
Differing remuneration arrangements. So one provider giving you 100%, one provider giving you 180%. Would that be a conflict of interest?
This is a classic example whereby that obviously could lean certain behaviour. So if it was found that the company that you always recommended was the company that paid the most, then well, the thing is, commission on its own is a conflict of interest. And for those of you that were at the NZFAA discussion at the conference, and a couple of advisors were a bit unhappy with me about this, but if you only get paid when a client buys a product, that's a natural conflict of interest, because you're less likely to say stay where you are because you don't get paid to tell them to stay where they are. So commission on its own is a conflict of interest, and for AFAs you have to describe in your ABS how you get around that or how you mitigate that potential conflict. So differing amounts of commission that can be a conflict as to whether you pick the green company or the blue company, but the fact is that if you only get paid by commission, your advice is potentially conflicted.
So it's anything that could influence the recommendations you make which don't necessarily accord with those of the client's needs.
Yes. It's that bit where you go, and unfortunately, I think there is really good advice given by the majority of commissioned advisors. The problem is, if that advice goes wrong, the challenge for the advisor then is to demonstrate that it was the best advice for the client, and I didn't just do it to get paid a commission. So that's the challenge. So the more you are, and the new code for AFAs puts more effort on it. You need to manage those conflicts of interest. So it's no use just saying it's a conflict of interest. You've actually got to manage it, which is demonstrate how do you get around that. Well, I use research and I use a methodology that then says this is the best product, and it just happens to be that particular company paid more than the other company. But I can demonstrate that the client's better off because of that advice.
It's an interesting one, isn't it? Because there is often there's no right or wrong answer, and actually having the processes and mechanisms in place to manage those conflicts could lead to some challenges.
Yes, and it is. I mean, it's one of the reasons they're requiring sort of advice in writing is because we need it's evidencing. We say to RFAs theoretically don't have to put advice in writing. There's no legal requirement to do it. But the fact is, you'll just leave yourself open to somebody making up the reasons why, and if someone found out that the only reason you shifted some business was because to a particular company because you got paid more, they can infer that, and unless you can demonstrate that that wasn't the reason, you're stuffed, potentially.
Okay. Moving on, I'm very conscious of time. Jonathan has asked, are there copies of samples of this documentation of this two-step advice process? The answer, Jonathan, is that yes, there is. We put some up on the members area of our website. So I will, at the end of the session, I'll send a link to those to the audience. So you'll need obviously a login to the members area of the website to get hold of that. One final point from Carol. She raised a point about the consultative process, and she makes the point that most clients are not interested in understanding the arcane features of insurance, and it's very difficult to ensure that their client understands enough without giving them an information overload under the consultative model. Any thoughts on that, Barry?
Yeah, look, I totally agree with Carol that we can't expect every client to be at the same level of financial literacy, and we can't expect every client to want to engage with our advice or sales processes. And which is why the traditional statement of advice could be a block for some people. What we want to try and do is at least say, and it's a bit like the disclosure document, the fact that the client received a product and service guide. Now, the fact is that they never open it and they throw it in the bin. That's up to them. But as long as they agree that you gave them that information and they did have the opportunity to read that and discover more if they wanted to make an informed decision, then great. But also don't try and force a client into an advice situation when really all they want to do is buy a product. But just make it really clear that it wasn't a financial advice situation, that it was a product advice situation. So yeah, definitely allow clients the ability to opt out of advice and opt out of informed decisions. But gee, just make sure it doesn't look as though you've used the same. Because what we see, Carol, is people then putting a statement of advice out because they think they have to do it to meet the regulations, but the client actually hasn't given them the information and the advisor hasn't made a recommendation, but the advice documentation says they are making a recommendation. And that's where the danger comes in.
Thank you, Barry. Thank you. I think we'll have to hold it there now. Thank you again for the putting this material together, Barry. This whole deconstructed advice process, I think, is the way of the future from the point of view of advice. I think it makes eminently more sense to me than potentially the standard six-step advice. It's really how advisors go about actually making that transition from the standard six-step to this type of.
And just picking up on Carol's point again, Carol's absolutely right. We need, rather than having one set of documentation, I guess, or one way of dealing with a client, and even if you don't use this two-step or three-step process or the six-step process, just ensure that the documentation evidences whatever process you use. That's the key to it.
Yeah. And
whichever one works for you and your clients is probably the right one. But that's, I guess, what I'm trying to say. We've given you the information about how the regulator looks at this stuff, and I would suggest to all of you, grab next Wednesday afternoon and listen to what Trevor has to say, because that's the rubber hitting the road as well.
Cool. Thank you once again. Anybody got any questions, feel free to fire them at me via email and I can run them by Barry if that's appropriate. I will send out a link to all attendees to a copy of this, of the recording of this session. So if you want to go back to it and refer to it, it will be available via our YouTube channel, which is privately listed. Any questions, feel free to come back to me. Thank you for your attendance. Hope you found it valuable. We will look forward to seeing you on the next one. Thanks a lot, Barry.
Cheers, David. Bye-bye.